Um, so-called 2023. I just wanted to take a moment to say, fuck Pope Gregory, just because it's important to do so. I think we forget this. We were talking about the retreat that's upcoming in April and the fact that we'll all get to be April Fools together. And of course, that got us talking about where that whole thing comes from. And it's because originally the pagan New Year was spring equinox. And that makes sense because, of course, it's the beginning of a new year, spring, growth, as opposed to our Gregorian calendar, which puts New Year right dead in the middle of winter, which is kind of funny. Doesn't make any sense at all. But so anyway, so people would practice the pagan New Year. And because now Catholics and Christians ruled the world and everybody was using the Gregorian calendar based on Pope Gregory, those that were still using the pagan New Year were called April Fools. If they were still saying Happy New Year as you were going into April, it's like, you're April Fool. And so that's really weird and kind of funny. But we've talked about this before, how so many things in our life are completely arbitrary, but we don't look at them that way. We never take the chance to actually question them. Like, for example, everybody is under the impression that it's Monday, but it's not Monday. That's just a name for the day that we're on. And it's not even the day that we're on. It's just every seventh day in this cycle. Because they're just names based on cycles, but the cycles themselves aren't actually accurate. The 7-day cycle is fairly accurate in that it's 4 7-day cycles is 1 lunar month, which is great. But there are 13 lunar months in a year. Right. But we take all of this for granted, like even the fact that we have a 24-hour day. That's not actually correct. Each and every day is actually a different length of time. Slightly. It's a different length of time each and every day based on our speed through the universe and the rotation of the world and all that other stuff. So we just kind of count on these numbers that are convenient. We count on these cycles that are habitual, and we forget that we made them up. We made them up. It's not actually 2023. That's also a funny number that we just kind of made up based on one dude's death.
Yeah, I find it very symbolic, all of it, just how little we question because, we don't want to feel uncomfortable or dig into it or see where it goes. But the reality being that as we do question that, we do become more free from the shackles that are holding us back from recognizing our true potential, because we get caught in a spot where it's like, oh, I'm comfortable right here. But yeah, all of the dates and the calendar stuff, it's funny how obvious it is that it isn't what it is, and yet we just don't even we don't even say it tongue in cheek or anything. Like, oh yeah, it's 2023. And it's not like, for myself, it wasn't even until, I don't know, I was in my early 20s that I started to be like, yeah, but is it? What's that based on? Oh, it's just based on this guy who lived at a certain time and we were able to create this entire thing. It's like we actually, not that we really do think that it's, anything's been 2023 years, but like we kind of do in a way. Like we discount how, like, eternity and all of that, and we just settle on this out of, I guess, convenience. But with because I'm not as much a history buff, with the Gregorian calendar, like, when did that even begin? And do you know some of the background on, like, the thinking behind that? Was he just desired control and wanted to do it his way and was just like, yeah, this makes sense?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, that was the whole thing, is like, they're the church, they should know. So yeah. And it's not that Pope Gregory was just, being willy-nilly about it. Of course, he made a calendar that, I don't know, I would guess made sense to him. I try to look at everything that way. Like, even the people who are the most terrible in our history, just like all of us, when we're self-destructing, like, we kind of think we're doing well. We kind of think we're doing the right thing right up until the end, kind of thing. But yeah, the Gregorian calendar is just kind of arbitrary. It's largely based on the calendars before it. The Julian calendar came before the Gregorian calendar. And then, of course, the church had a hand in wiping out pretty much every other calendar, including the Mayan calendars and whatnot, right? Because the church was just expanding all over the world. Because if you control the calendars, you really control a good portion of the narrative, right? Like that, it's not just that the year 2023 sets an arbitrary date. It kind of implies that everything started there, that all of the knowledge before then didn't exist, like that we were in the caveman ages until Jesus came along to set us free. Like there's a lot of implication in the idea of it being 2023, right? And we tend to forget there's a shit ton of history before that. Lots. It's just that, especially in the Christian dominated world, we don't focus on that. I mean, hell, in school, we don't even focus on history, really. We focus on the history of those that would take advantage of us throughout our lifetime. We focus on the history of our country and how awesome it is that these people took over this chunk of land from other people, probably violently, right? And we forget there was a lot of other violent people before them that brought them here. And there's a whole history of stuff, not just violence, obviously, but progress, so-called, but invention, enthusiasm, connection, growth, adaptation, that's all in our history. And it goes way, way, way farther back than 2,000 years. So, yeah, I think that perspective changes things a lot. Because, I mean, it would be more accurate to say, like, we're over 1 billion years old or something like that. Like, it would be more accurate to try and guess the age of the planet and just give it an arbitrary number than just start it 2,000 years ago based on a fictional zombie Jesus.
Yeah, and thinking about that sort of arbitrary date of 2,000 years ago or whatever, when we and looking at history of, in the US, that's kind of what our history classes circle around. And it's interesting how it goes on both sides. Like the people who see that and don't look past it, they either see it in a positive light and they're like, oh yeah, they did a great job. They created the best country in the world, blah, 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 freedom, et cetera, et cetera. And then the people on the flip side are also kind of stopping at that point. The people who are like, oh, they're, colonists. It was awful. It was terrible. Our history is objectively terrible, which, there's a lot to be said for that. Absolutely. But both sides kind of stop at where we're taught, like in the last couple 100 years, and they don't. It seems like neither side is willing to look further back and see, not like empathy for colonizers by any means, but see where that mentality comes from and look beyond that. Kind of like we've talked about, like colonizers were colonized, and it goes way back. But we have such a limited view of our history that we don't, on either side, it's like we're comfortable settling on that and only looking at the things that we want to, sort of, that fits our narrative of the way things are, whether it's objectively awful or objectively awesome because, we have freedom now and whatnot. And so I just find it interesting how oftentimes we're only willing to go back to the point, looking back at history, that makes us comfortable. And it's like, even if that's a couple thousand years, like going beyond that, even like, 10,000 years of written history, like there's a lot before that. And there are a lot of things that happened before then. And it could even be that right now we're not in, peak humanity. We're not in the most advanced society that's ever been. And a lot of people settle on that, like on either side, that this is, the most advanced and the best type of situation we've ever existed in. And it's like, where is that assumption coming from? I guess it's from comfort and being able to validate the idea that we're doing everything correctly in the best way possible. And yet our peak idea of human potential is having a lot of money, which isn't even a thing that's real. Like that's our barometer. That's our mark, is having a bunch of made up stuff for myself that has a big number in my bank account is kind of the extent. And we think that's like peak human society. And we discount, like, thinking about teleportation or telekinesis or any of the deeper shit that could be possible as we let go of those arbitrary levels to which we think are best for humans. Like, we almost don't even think that's a possibility, and yet we do see it from time to time. It's like we don't even want to look at it because it makes us uncomfortable, I guess. It's just, yeah, I mean, comfort, discomfort, it's fascinating how people just are so unwilling to go beyond what keeps them comfortable.
Yeah, and we're very comfortable with the mindset that we have in terms of what our existence is all about. We're very comfortable with it, despite the fact that so many of us believe that life is suffering, and so many of us believe that we're disconnected, and so many of us are experiencing the perception of a division from the universe. We still think, nah, we're doing great. Like, we're suffering all the time. We know we are. There is a mental health pandemic that's massive, and still we continue on. True, we try to, I guess, introduce more band-aid approaches. Let's get more counselors out there. Let's get more clinics out there. Let's try and offer more short-term solutions in the hope that maybe we'll limp on long enough for something to change. But the fact is, nothing's going to change because the system itself doesn't want to change. The system is actually opposed to change, right? You talk to somebody about letting go of money and they're just like, oh, communist. And it's like, whoa, hold on. There's a lot of gray area in between that, right? Or you talk to people about letting go of this system, and the response I always get a kick out of is, oh, you want to go back to like the caveman days. Like, no, there is a lot of gray area in between that. It's not like we have to discount everything that we've learned just to learn from our mistakes. Like, we keep the stuff that's useful. We jettison the shit that's toxic. And we find something new. We've been doing this forever. It's like the government that we're all experiencing right now, wherever we might be, came from a lot of other things before it. So we're always going through change. It's just that we don't know what it means to let this go. And there are some obvious roadblocks in terms of a lot of very powerful people who are benefiting from a lot of us feeling disempowered. And so there's a lot of mechanisms to keep those powerful people feeling powerful and us feeling disempowered, such as the economy and climate change, the war, giant militaries that exist all over this world, and a host of other things. But those are other problems. Those are problems that we can't tackle. Those are problems that we can't tear apart because they know how to deal with that. They know how to react to that mentality. That's the mentality they're built on. But again, kind of the feet on the coffee table revolution, where it's just like, no, I don't find that important. Enough of us doing that for long enough changes the priority of the world.
Yeah, it'll be fun to see how that all shakes out as we're shaking it out. So I'm kind of curious when we talk about people and their perspective on things and doing the right thing. Like, we all have a different idea of what the right thing is based on, I don't know, it seems pretty interconnected with how we see ourselves relative to reality. So, and even, because talking about good or bad, people who are extremely destructive people, it's like nothing's objectively good or bad, but there is constructive, destructive, and whatnot. And so I'm curious if people taking their actions like someone extreme, talking about like the Nazis or Hitler or something like that, like, do you think everyone is always doing what they think is the right thing based on their perception of themselves and reality? Or do you think people know what the right thing to do is and do something else, or have an idea of what the right thing and then do something else? Or are we always doing what, almost whether we know it or not, what we think is best, what we think is right for reality / ourself, based on the level of distortion that we have about ourself and the rest of reality.
I think that, as always, it's variable. Like it really does matter on about the person. Just like right now, like there is a global mentality that a lot of people are just a part of without recognizing that they're a part of it, or that there are options. And it's because that's the environment that they grew up within. That's the way that they've learned to perceive the world. That's the priorities that they've been taught to look at in terms of what's important about me and the world, and how do I fit in, and all of that. And so I think that's always true. I think, remember, it wasn't that long ago we were doing public hangings, right? And that was a normal thing. You'd take your kids down to the public square to see a hanging. Like that's something that happened, and it was normal. It was normal at that point. Now we look at that and we're like, oh my God, what is happening there? And the same will be true in a couple hundred years, where people will look back at what we're doing now and they'll go, oh my God, what's happening there? Right. And so, yeah, it really does come down to our environment to some degree, but that's why awareness is so important, because it's not that there is a right and a wrong. It's that there are levels of destructive and constructive, and that always tends to be dictated by awareness and sensitivity, right? The more aware you become, the more sensitive you are, the more empathetic you tend to become, right? Because you can see everything. Like you see it going back and forth, one side or the other. You're not just sitting on one side for your own sake, because that's what's cutting off your awareness. So it's always like that. And I think that's the whole point. That's the reason this discussion is so important, because we're saying that awareness is the fundamental influencer under all of this. That if we as a society, or we as an individual, are not focused on simply awareness, without the confusion of identity, without the confusion of need and lack and fiction that isn't there, then we're doomed to be more destructive, simply because we don't see that we're being more destructive, right? Like people look at like, well, you mentioned Hitler, Nazi Germany, all of that. There was a long progression that led up to Nazi Germany, going way back, like way farther back than Hitler. Like there was a lot that led up to Hitler, including up to World War I, which inevitably was where Hitler went to jail, and a lot of the things that he was going through became solidified. Like there's a lot, and it's our environment. And then not just that, but I mean, Hitler himself wouldn't have come to power if it wasn't for one of the leading political parties thinking that they could use him to their advantage. That's the thing. They're like, oh, he's gaining a lot of support. Let's ally with him so we can benefit our party. And he ended up just taking them by storm. Like they opened the gate and he came through, right? But they did it for their own purposes. They did it according to the system that would benefit them. They did it because they thought it was right, according to what they perceived was best for themselves, right? So there's a lot that led up to all of that, right? Where had that system not necessarily been in place, had there been a more aware society, right? Critically thinking, questioning people, perhaps that would have been stopped decades before, right? Through just a change of something else. You know, maybe Hitler had been accepted to art school, and that had changed his whole path. Who knows? We'd be looking at paintings by Adolf Hitler without thinking about all the horrible shit that went with that story, right?
Yeah. And so I almost see it like the constructive, destructive. We never really know how that's going to turn out, but it's almost like the spectrum I see is between awareness being broader, like a broader point of view, which is more tied into like open-mindedness and not being so set and settled. Like it's fluid on one end. It's broad, fluid, open-minded awareness, as opposed to narrow, specific, this is it, this is right, this is wrong. And so it's not even like a right and a wrong spectrum. It's your willingness to broaden your perspective and question your idea of what's right and wrong. And the shit that gets us into a bunch of shit is not whether something's right or wrong. It's the mentality that believes that there is a specific right and wrong. And so it's like a way that you are willing to see things and question things. And that willingness to be open and not settle on a right or a wrong allows us to keep in mind all of the different potential outcomes to something, as opposed to just being so focused on one specific thing, thinking that's it. Because as we do that, like, there is no right or wrong. Like, everything exists kind of in flux, and there's so many variables that go into, like, there's so many variables that go into every decision and situation, and we like to simplify things so much and put them in this vacuum. And kind of like I was just expressing, and you kind of clarified with Nazi Germany and with Hitler, like, there was a ton of shit that led to that, but we just put our blinders on, and just like Nazi Germany, we kind of have it in a vacuum. It's like when you recognize that there's no division between moments, experiences, situations, all of eternity, like, everything in all of eternity led to Nazi Germany. And we like to parse it out and be like, this was a bad thing, this is a good thing. But it's that mentality that's divisive, whether it's divisive in physicality, like of me versus you, or events or situations. It's like that end of the spectrum that is believing that things do exist separately, that moments exist separately, that situations exist separately. That idea that this is right, this is wrong, is what keeps us in this situation, as opposed to, if we kind of zoom out, open up our perspectives, recognize that we don't know, there maybe isn't, a specific right choice or wrong choice. There's just a infinite number of options that exist on a spectrum, and we don't know how they're going to turn out. But it's like, through recognizing that, as opposed to pointing to this and being like, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, it allows us to get closer to, a less destructive way of being and less destructive choices. But I see it just on that spectrum of like open-mindedness to right and wrong is this and that. There's a right and a wrong way to be. Good and bad things happen, and they're very, secluded and separate, versus open also being tied into unified and a lack of division.
Yeah. And likewise, with all the other divisive perceptions, the idea of different people, not just good and bad, but that there are different people who are good and bad. When we see somebody who is selfish, we tend to look at them as somebody who is selfish. We don't tend to look at it as a part of ourself that's still suffering through selfishness, through the illusion of it. We don't see that. We don't see it that way. And if we did, it would change our approach. It would also change the lessons that we get from it. Like Nazi Germany, since we're on the topic, we don't, and we haven't, and we didn't look at that as an inevitable wave caused by the mentality that we were collectively embodying. We'd rather say all Nazis were evil, but they were people who, much like other people in the world right now, enlisted in the military because it was the thing to do, believed the government because everybody else believed the government, didn't question because nobody else was questioning, until they basically had the tail of the tiger, until it was too late. Right? And so it's not that they were evil. It's just that they followed a mentality so far that it led to its inevitable conclusion. Right? But that was a cascade. That was a series of events that happened throughout numerous people over a decade. Like, it took a long time for all of that to come to fruition. It's not just that all of a sudden people just turned evil, right? There was a lot there, and we didn't see it as, oh, wow, look at that part of our mentality. Like that's where this goes. We didn't. We just went, they're evil. We got to stamp them down. Oh, except those guys. They've invented rockets, and this guy invented mustard gas. Let's bring them on to the team. And that's exactly what happened. Was they basically defeated the Nazis and then took all the useful Nazis and maintained the mentality that created the Nazis.
That's pretty interesting. I don't know how much I knew about that, which I guess
NASA was created by Nazi rockets and Nazi scientists.
holy shit. I mean, that just goes to show, like, the fact that I am unaware of that just goes to show how it's not openly discussed, because that would make people uncomfortable. Like, we're actually able to take something again in a vacuum, just be like, oh yeah, this is completely separate. It's like there's literal overlap between Nazi Germany and something like NASA, that now we don't see that in a negative viewpoint. I had a hat in high school that had NASA on it. Like, wouldn't have thought twice about that being started by
Not started
Nazis.
by, but definitely grown with, right? Like the Nazis had, well, just a shit ton of technological innovation. That's the reason that World War II went on so long. It's the reason that Hitler felt so confident, right? It was because the German people themselves have always been leaders of industry, right? Even through World War One, that was one of the reasons the Kaiser felt so confident as well. Like, Germany's always been one of the most industrious countries in the world, right? They've always been at the front of technology, even now, right? And so all of those scientists, well, they were still useful. Like the scientists who invented the rockets and whatnot that were used against, Hitler's enemies, basically. Well, those scientists were useful. And so, yeah, largely they were recruited and brought to NASA to help develop the space program, right? Because they're useful, but we don't talk about that, right? And it's just, okay, but what else did they design? Well, what else did we use those rockets for? Oh, other missiles and the military industrial complex, which all benefited from Nazi technology. Because we didn't fight the war to end the war, we fought the war and got better at war. Right? That's the saddest part about the expression from World War I, that it was the war to end all wars. It's actually what they called it. And it didn't. Right? It just led us to the next century of warfare like we had never seen. Because we're still in perpetual war all the time. We don't call it that. That's how fucked things have gotten, right? We almost never call things a war, despite the fact that there are conflicts all over the world right now that would be considered war, right? One way or another. So we just kind of tap dance around it, because I think we know that if we ever really threw down with everything, we'd wipe ourselves off the map, or at least a good portion of ourselves, right? Like, we've known that for a long time. MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? That's the whole basis for the Cold War, right? Once one goes, they all go. So there's no point in anyone firing a shot. We're still just kind of sitting there. We're still sitting in that. And we call that peace.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, with symbolism, like as above, so below, if everything is always just symbolic of the degree to which we're confused about ourselves. Like, it's always, we're in conflict with reality, and we're so distorted, believing that the description is the described, that it manifests in so many different ways. And if it really makes me wonder if the symbolism isn't like perfect, always exactly the way in which I see myself, how clearly I see myself, is reflective in all of the rest of all of the situations that happen in all of reality. Like, everything going on this planet, it is always a reflection of where we're at collectively, of where I'm at, of me. And because people even say, like, you know, you see the world as you change the way you look at things, that things you look at change. And I've heard that so many times, and I think there's a depth to that that is not fully understood by a lot, like we by a lot of people. And so we see it, it's like, oh, you know, your perspective on things, like you see the world as a beautiful thing, and like you experience it, you see it as a horrible, disgusting, awful thing, and that's all you ever see. But at the same time, like, as you change your viewpoint of yourself and recognize, like we've been talking about, that you've always been in the flow, it's like, as that perspective shifts, you actually have impact on it. And yes, you see things differently, which allows for, you know, like, more clarity to actually have impact on it. But anyway, going back to that first point, just like the perfect symbolism always of every degree of reality, from the largest events to the smallest, most minuscule, like, I don't know, how peaceful I feel pouring my cup of coffee in the morning. You know, even on any level of the spectrum, it's all impacting all of it. Makes me wonder.
Yeah, well, you're not the only person. I've been, well, you are the only person, but I've been wondering this myself for years. Like, we've talked about this, about how I don't tend to see the world as the physical thing that everybody else takes as at face value. To me, it's more subjective, but as such, it's totally symbolic. It's all symbolism. I've been saying this for a long time. It's all symbolism. Now, what does that mean, and how do you use that? That's a great question. I don't think you should use that. I think that that's just part of how you process things when you're out of the way, when you're in a deeper state of awareness. And on that note, actually, for anybody who hasn't seen it already, you should check out the latest community topics number 18, which is all about the tarot and imagination. We really go into exactly what we're talking about in this episode right now. We're talking about awareness on a deeper level, to the point where symbolic meaning and cyclical timing are all just part of how you're processing the universe, or how you're processing reality. Because we don't typically process it that way. We typically have no imagination whatsoever. We stick to very small concepts, and we process things very slowly based on how we're feeling. And there's so much that goes into that. But when you get out of all that, and you're just, as we said, an exposed nerve, there's deep symbolism. There's incredible timing all the time, if you're just watching it rather than trying to outpace it, which is often the case. Again, at the retreat, I really had that sense that it's like my thoughts were just a second behind reality. Like, I would start worrying about the next thing to do, and immediately somebody would come along and tell me what the next thing to do was, not directly, but just kind of by virtue of their existence. Like, oh, look at all those doors that just opened. Right. But it was always like, up to that second, oh gosh, should I be doing something? Where should I be going? Maybe I should go in my, boom. And so I watched that for a little while, and it was hilarious to watch my doubts right up until the moment where reality solved the problem. Like, just not getting involved with them, just watching them, doubt, bam, next branch. And that was it. And so I did that for, I think, an hour or two, just kind of giggling to myself at how clear and obvious it was at that time. But we don't always exist in that state of awareness. We're not always slowed down to the point where we can watch our thoughts without being immediately triggered by each and every one of them, right? Thinking that they have something to do with us personally, like, oh God, that's uncomfortable, I should do something about it, I need to cope, I need to balance this out, I need to get in there. It's just let it pass, watch, see what happens next. Right. So yeah, it's a very different state of awareness. And again, I say that cautioning the listener to try and do that, because that's not doing that. We were saying this on a Patreon call recently. You can't try to relax.
Yeah, it's funny how listening to that, and I guess in the mentality I've been in just, from my experience, I hear something like that and immediately I'm like, oh, so just don't do anything. Just sit there. No, never mind.
That
Just
sounds
sit
like you're
there.
trying to relax.
Yeah, exactly. And like just sit there on my hands and not do anything. And there's almost like a feeling of death that comes with that when you let go of you inflicting your will on things. And all, because we always feel like if something's happening, we have to do something about it. Like we have to actively, attack the situation, change things, go grind and go get it and do it. And that whole mentality is just so egotistical in the sense that you feel like you always have to be the one doing it. Like you're the one always doing it, and not recognizing the broadness of yourself and reality. And it's not that you don't do anything, it's just a subtle shift in and I mean, subtle, sort of subtle, but it's a shift in the way that you interact with reality. And like you're still doing all the stuff you've always done, but without the suffering and without the idea that it's not happening perfectly. And like that changes all the things that happen. And like you were saying, when you let go of the feeling like you had to go change things, it's like sometimes someone would come up to you and inform you about something. But if you weren't there for it, if you weren't paying attention to reality, you wouldn't have heard what they said. You wouldn't have seen what was happening. And so it's always there. It's always right there. And all you ever have to do is pay attention to it. And that will inform you more than you trying to inflict and instill your will upon the situation, because that always clouds our ability to see what's happening. Because oftentimes when you're looking for, an answer or what to do, it's like it's kind of all around you, but you think you're the one who has to figure it out. Could be that someone else has been talking to you and you've been so set on the idea of you haven't heard what they're saying. And if you had let go of the idea that you're the one who has to figure it out, just let reality happen, may happen way more easily. Likely, almost definitely will happen way more easily.
Yeah, it's funny. Quick tangent. It got me thinking about childhood, right? Because that's how we start. We don't start with this litany of doubt, right? We don't start with this soundtrack about ourselves all the time in our head at all. We just kind of start as an exposed nerve. Reality informs. We watch reality. We choose a direction. We go down that direction. We learn more. We choose another direction. We go down the direction. We learn more. Over time, we start building this idea of ourselves, or our brain starts to build this idea of ourselves as it learns concepts and whatnot. And so it's like we forget nothing changed. You're still experiencing life in the same way. It's just that now you have an arsenal of concepts, right? That unfortunately can also become kind of a wall. But that goes to my second point, that see, we know that our perception of need and our perception of lack changes what we do. We know that because we know that as people become more desperate, they tend to turn more to crime. We know this, right? These are people who wouldn't be criminals otherwise. So it's the stress of their environment that's actually overweighing their awareness of the destruction they're causing, or, well, yeah, and limiting the empathy out of necessity because you're trying to survive. So there's that divisive environment, once again, motivating you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do out of a need to survive. So you look at our society, you look at the amount of crime, you look at the amount of corruption, and you look at the environment and you realize, oh, this is what makes sense in a divisive mentality. Because it is. In a divisive mentality, it makes sense to take care of yourself. It makes sense to get yours. It makes sense to have the biggest house, right? It makes sense to value yourself through all these things. It makes sense in a divisive mentality because you're alone. Of course, you got to take care of yourself. And so when you look at the world, as much as we want to vilify it, all of this makes sense according to how we see ourselves as separate. And that's the point. It is symbolism, and it affects everything, right down to nature. Right? Look what's happening to nature. Like, it's slowly disappearing. Right? Not that it will ever disappear, because of course we'll disappear long before it does, but yeah, it's all symbolism.
Yeah, that statement, getting yours, kind of hit me, because it's like the difference between a criminal and someone who's not a criminal. It's not that their mentality is any different. It's just the way in which they do it. That's it. Like, there's not even, oh, fuck. There's not even so like laws, because laws are made up by us based on our experiences and whatnot. You know, getting yours, the difference between a criminal and someone who isn't is just which side of the arbitrary line of the law they exist upon. And that's dictated based on how deep that sense of lack is and how much need you have to get yours, you know, to steal or satisfy this desire to, I don't even know what, you know, killing would actually lead to, like a murder or whatnot, like what deeper desire. I guess that differs completely, but by the person. But like, seeing that with the mentality of just being your idea of you, and that's it, cut off from all of reality, as we live based on that idea, whether or not we commit crimes is just based off of our experiences, the influences that we had growing up, how we saw things could be done, you know, things that we were taught. But it's the same root of selfishness, of that doing it solely for yourself because that's all that you think that you are. So many people are acting in that same way, and just some subtle shifts in their upbringing, in their experiences, would have caused them to flip over on the other side of that line. But it's like the root mentality isn't any different on either side. It's just whether or not you commit a crime is dependent upon which side of that arbitrary line you fall upon, which was all made up by us. Again, like, all the things in this reality, they're not inherently tied to the fabric of reality. Like, none of it was ever said that it had to be this way. Like, any law, from the most extreme laws, even, it's just how we developed based on the experiences that we have. But that's the same on the collective, how we developed the laws, and the individual, how we developed and how we viewed those laws and the system that created it, and our willingness to buy in or buy out of it, and the likelihood of, you know, getting away with something, or the degree to which we feel like we need to do something, and our lack of care of whether or not, you know, we get away with it because we're so desperate in ourselves to satisfy that black hole of desire for satisfaction, or to be seen, or whatever it may be, that we don't necessarily have an idea of the best way to go about that. So we do our best to do it, existing in a state of distortion. But as we let go of that, it has to be on both sides of that arbitrary line of the law for it to shift. It can't be just through putting more band-aids on and just like putting more laws on top of it. It has to be a shift in mentality within yourself, within myself, within ourself.
There has to be empathy. There has to be empathy, right? And that's what we miss. That's why so much of our history, especially in North America, was, you know, prisons where people were mistreated. Like, you did something wrong. Obviously, beating you is going to help you learn, right? Or sticking you in this box is going to help you learn. It wasn't about them learning. It was about us punishing. It was about us validating ourselves. we're good people, they're bad people, therefore they should be punished, right? Whereas in Europe, and actually here in British Columbia, they've decriminalized all drugs, right? All major drugs. Whoa, why? Well, because there's a stigma that creates the need for people to hide, and people who are hiding often end up dealing with other people who are hiding, who have nefarious reasons for doing so. And so it adds to crime. It adds to not just crime, but it adds to shame. It adds to people overdosing because they don't feel safe that they can connect to other people when they might need help, right? And so British Columbia is trying that now for the next 3 years. In Europe, there's, I don't remember which country it is. I was watching this on a documentary. I thought it was fantastic. Basically, their prison is like a little community that's separated from everywhere else, where even people who have, gone to quote unquote jail for murder are in the kitchen volunteering and holding knives and like cutting dinner and stuff for people. Trusted, and as a result of being trusted, as a result of having something that adds value to themselves, or they perceive is a way for them to express their value, I guess is a better way of putting it, they start to get better. And it's because the society that's around them doesn't look at them as something's wrong. It looks, or that doesn't look at them like that something's wrong with them. It looks at it like there's something wrong with the environment, that these people are sick and just need help so they can heal themselves, right? That there's a way that we get there that's not just defining you as a terrible person. And if we had that approach long term for people growing up in the system, not just people who are being introduced to this program now, because it's useful now, but we've never seen what that will do over 50 years. We've never tried it, right? And so I think that's the point, is just a little bit more freedom, a little bit more empathy, and society will slowly change. But it very much comes down to how we view ourselves and how we view others as a result. If I'm trying to self-define, then I need to judge other people.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. Like, you can't really have one without the other. And yet we try to avoid judgment while holding on to the limited idea of myself and therefore other people, and comparison and that kind of mentality. But and even experiencing empathy through a state of a perception of division being the truth is still going to be limited to the degree that which you can experience that empathy, and so when I see with the prison system and jail and whatnot, like, it's just such a short term like satisfaction. Like, we don't want to look at it or change anything because we're so caught up in the idea of ourselves. And because of that, we see ourselves as having a 70, 80, 90-year lifetime. And so we don't really care how reality is impacted beyond our lifetime. Maybe we do for our kids, so it's like one generation, but for the next beyond 100 years from now, doesn't really matter too much to us. So we're just constantly looking for short-term band-aid solutions to things when it's pretty obvious that they're not a cure or an actually long-term solution. But if we do work on those longer-term solutions, there is a process of learning about that. And we're not willing to face that because there could be some bumps along that road because it's such a different mentality. And so as soon as we hit a bump in that road, we're just like, oh, just stop that. No more of that, because we have such a limited perspective on things. And as much as people like to say that they care about everything else happening, and there are a lot of people who do so, who still hold on to the limited idea of themselves, but it's almost like, is it possible to have a an actually long-term view of solutions and fixing problems while you're holding on pretty tightly to the limited idea of yourself? Seems like it's almost there's an inherent limitation based on how limited of a view you see yourself for the ways you see solutions for a lot of the things we're dealing with right now.
That's a really interesting point, right? Like it kind of makes you wonder, how would, if you were to leave a lasting message for society going forward, what would that message be in terms of guidance? Because you can't control, right? But there has to be some indicator that we're confused, right? Fear. That's it. You ever notice in politics, there's never anyone who stops and goes, "You sound really afraid, though. Maybe your opinion's not coming from a place of clarity." Nobody does that, right? Like, because they actually use fear to their advantage, and we drive everything with fear, right? But as a society, as a group, as a collective, as an individual collective, however you'd like to put it, if we recognize that fear is almost always a sign that we're seeing things from a distorted point of view, and I don't mean fear like someone's chasing you with a knife. That's a different kind of fear. I mean psychological fear, where there's no actual danger in front of you, but you are afraid of being less. You're afraid of how it defines you. So egotistical fear is kind of what I'm saying. So at that point, I think if we could just keep an eye on that, that would change, quote unquote, politics. That would change how we operate largely, but we lose sight of that. Again, you look at religion and its fixation on faith. That's kind of what they're getting across, right? But they don't put it that way. They don't really say, like, if you're afraid, let that pass. Though we really do try to imply it a lot in a lot of our different belief structures around God, right? Have faith and all that, surrender to God's will, but at the same token, watch out for all of God's rules and live up according to these expectations. And so there's a lot of contradictions, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's still that root distortion that's always going to reinforce that fear that you're experiencing. But it does make me wonder with psychological fear. I think that is the case, that the degree of psychological fear we experience is entirely connected to the perception of division we experience between and feel between ourselves and the rest of reality. Because I've said this before, like there's gray area and nuance with everything, but to a degree, it's like we suffer based on the things we identify as, and we fear the things we don't identify as. And so it's always that sort of spectrum. So as you let go of the specific thing you identify as, it's not that you experience suffering in the same way, but I guess suffering when it's outside of the idea of you could be empathy in a way. Like if you're identified just as your idea of yourself and someone makes fun of, your hand, you suffer. You don't suffer. I don't suffer when someone makes fun of Ray's hand, because I don't identify as that. But as I let go of the idea of me, someone makes fun of Ray's hand. It's not that I suffer in the same way, but I experience that in a state of empathy. And then when things, they're like fucking cutting down forests left and right, or like shaving off the tops of mountains. It's not that I suffer in the way that I did when I was so caught up in the idea of myself, but to a degree, there is an experience of suffering, because that is, as I let go of the idea of myself, it's like that's now within myself. And so there's more suffering there. And so it's like that goes for all of reality and all of society. So I guess it is kind of on that spectrum of how you see things. And it's not that it has to be a negative thing, but you just experience the empathy for things. Like suffering when you're caught up in the idea of yourself could be a degree of empathy for yourself for going through the situation in a way, sort of. Like I see them, I don't know if that's getting across, but like I'm seeing suffering and empathy as kind of interconnected based on the degree to which you perceive division, and yourself suffering almost becomes empathy in a way. So then on the other end, fear, seeing fear as like you're afraid of things that you don't identify as, at least psychologically. As Ray said, like, you know, someone's chasing you with a knife, there's like an inherent physical fear to that, like that's a protective mechanism, and that's totally useful and super beneficial, and I'm super glad that we experienced that. But with a psychological fear, it's like any sort of the common fears that we experience in society, you wouldn't fear something when you're talking or when you're recognizing that everyone there is you, everything you're doing is you. Like if, for example, just like public speaking, you're talking to a bunch of people, as you recognize yourself in all of them, the fear goes down. Just like if you're alone in your room, just talking out loud, there's very rarely fear in that way because it's just you. But then if you're in a room full of 1,000 people, it's still just you. You're still just talking to yourself. And the amount of distortion that you perceive based on the difference, you know, between yourself and reality, like that's the degree to which you psychologically fear things. So I see that fear and suffering, and then suffering turns to empathy as you let go of that idea of yourself. There's less to fear as you let go of the idea of yourself, because there is less things that you don't identify as, which is kind of where fear is rooted.
Absolutely. Right? It's like the fear of judgment. Who are you afraid of judging you? Well, other people. How do you think they're going to judge you? And then you'll list all of your judgments of yourself. Oh, so you think they're going to judge you like you judge yourself? Because that's the point, right? Is that you're perceiving these people as separate, but you're still perceiving them as you, whether you recognize it or not. That's the whole point, right? You perceive their judgments as their judgments, but they're your judgments coming through them. You're just not willing to accept that they're your judgments, and so you hold on to the idea that they're theirs. But they weren't theirs. They're yours, but you don't want to be everyone. So you blame others.
Yeah, that's a funny one when you start to recognize it. Like if you actually looked at the things you're afraid of being judged for, it's just how you judge yourself. So whether you recognize yourself in everyone else clearly or not, it's still just you. So even if it's the idea of you you're caught up in, like you're still seeing the idea of you in them. And so no matter what, you're always seeing yourself, whether it's the reality of you or the idea of you, because everyone's always just a reflection. And, you know, the degree to which you perceive yourself to have a mask on, you perceive them to have a mask on. Like it's all like we think of it as a shield, but really it's a barrier. Really, it's a wall between yourself and reality. But we perceive that wall to protect us, when in reality it's just cutting us off from reality and from the flow and from the peace that's available when we let go of that perception of division and that idea that it's not just us. So then as you let go of the wall between yourself and reality, you let go of the wall between everyone else, and then you're seeing yourself as well. But instead of the idea of yourself, it's the truth of yourself. But it has to be through you and a letting go of the perception of you as something separate from anything or anyone. And as you continue on that process, you begin to see yourself more clearly, that truth of what you are in everyone and everything else as well. And then, you know, you got less fear, more empathy, less suffering.
We always want to avoid the reality, though. The only thing you know is you. The only thing you've ever known is you. The universe that you're aware of is your awareness, as we were saying. We don't like that. It's uncomfortable, right? Like that's a deep hole. It's like, okay, what about everybody else? Still, you know it through yourself. even all the physical sensations, even the world that you see isn't necessarily the result of your biology, but your interpretation of that biology, right? An interesting experiment, actually. So they had this group of people put on these specialized glasses, and these glasses would reverse the image of what you were looking at. So everything that you saw was upside down. And the group was expected to keep these glasses on for a certain period of time, and they did so. And you want to know the funny part? Eventually, they started seeing the world right side up because their brain adapted to make it make sense. So it wasn't even about what their body was interpreting anymore. It was about their mind interpreting it in a way that made sense, because we're very adaptable. But we tend to think like, no, if I didn't see the world this way, it would always be upside down. Your brain's going to adapt with you, and that's true for your perception of everyone else. Right? If you think you're perceiving everybody as separate, that's how you perceive them. That's what makes sense to you. Right? You'll see it that way. See, it doesn't make sense to me anymore, or at least it makes sense to me less and less. And so as a result, I don't perceive people that way. My brain doesn't make that my reality because that doesn't make sense to me anymore. I've questioned that.
So when they have the glasses on, so right now, for example, in my view, like my computer in front of me is, screen, keys below it. So it flipped it so it was keys above, screen below. But then you're saying like their brain was able to switch it so it's screen above, keys below.
For their experience. Yeah.
Damn. Okay. So because I
So
guess
what makes you think your brain's not doing that now?
Yeah, I can't say. There's
We
no
are
way.
not seeing reality. We know this. We're not seeing reality. We're not even touching reality because no atoms touch. I'm just going to leave that there in that awkward silence.
Oh man. Okay, so let's fucking take this where we're going now. So on Friday on our call, we were talking and I was like just very relaxed, kind of felt like I was tripping, and I was able to, I think someone brought up death. We were talking about that a little bit and that experience. And I was able to almost experience a perception of what I feel like it would be like as we were talking. And it was like just an extreme letting go. And it was kind of like the white light sensation of just everything going in back into, whiteness. And I was feeling like, holy shit, this was all a dream. Like this was all me hallucinating this entire experience, all of it. And so this idea that we're perceiving things how our brain is telling us they're being perceived, and even that, atoms don't touch. It's like the whole thing is a hallucination.
Yes and
Like,
no.
yeah.
It's as real as you are.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying is now.
See, we have to redefine real, right? Like that's the whole
Yeah.
thing about the idea of real. It doesn't make sense when you start looking at it from this perspective, right? The dream of reality itself is reality. You can't, there's no unreal. So that's kind of the point, right? Like it's not a hallucination. It's just not what it appears to be, right? We have the experience and the perception of division that can't possibly exist. That's what makes it a miracle.
Oh man. Yeah. Okay. So with it almost felt like on that call, it was kind of like video game type feeling where it's like you wake up to realize it is really like waking up and being like, oh my God, it was all a dream. But that was this.
A really real dream. Like that's
Yeah.
the thing, is that you don't want to take that too far. Like there's two perspectives here, and both of them are very important. One, the first is that this is as real as it gets, suffering included. Suffering, pain, fear, doubt, all that shit. It's all in there. Okay, so it's really important to recognize that when you're going through that, it's real. It's very, very real, which is what makes it suck even more. You can't forget that about the experience of suffering, because that's what disconnects you from everyone else when you do get to the other far side of the pendulum, which is that, oh shit, I'm eternal and there's nothing actually to fear, and whatever I go through is kind of temporary, and I'm going to do this forever anyway. And that's the other side of the spectrum, where it starts to feel video game like, where you're like, oh, worst that could happen is I die. And that's how far apart those two perspectives are. And so there's so much gray area that you have to live within. Otherwise, you get disconnected from everybody within that gray area, which is everybody. Right. And this is why people like Teal Swan went to one side of the perspective and they went, oh, suicide is just a reset button. Now you're devaluing the experience of living. Right? Now you're devaluing the importance of pain and suffering. And so it really is important to live on both sides of that spectrum, both and neither, as always.
Yeah, because I think so. Thinking about that sort of feeling where I saw, at least in my current state, what death may be like, just extreme relaxation, letting go of all of the things I believe to be true. There was still a twang of ego in that, like, idea of myself, because I'm still perceiving myself dying, basically. Like it's like a letting go of myself as I'm holding on to myself almost.
That's an interesting point, because what you think of as yourself is really division. Right? Like that's the whole thing. Like you're thinking about yourself as the experience of division. And that's true. We've actually talked about this. This is where we tend to disagree with the non-duality crowd. There is no me. There's no me. There's always a me. There's always a me. But it's not the idea of you. It's the experience of quote unquote you. Right? That always exists. But when you're looking at death, that's the end of that illusion. Right? Not that it ever ends, because it never really existed. It was all just potential anyway. Right? But that's kind of the point. It's a fun conversation when you get down to it.
Yeah, because it's like that. I mean, like you were saying, it's the balance between recognizing it, but not. It's almost like not staying. Like you can stay in it, sort of.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point of your life is to not be in it.
Yeah.
Right? The question is, how big's the gap? See, that's my question, right? Like the entire idea of an ego death or ego dissolution is the realization that you can touch home, right? Like you can touch home, you can tap into home, psychedelic experiences, deep states of relaxation, meditation, near-death experiences. All of these things are you catching a glimpse of your vastness and that relaxation. But going back to your point about fear of death and all that, it's again, it's this idea that without the experience, there is no you. Right? And you are the foundation of all experience. The experience and the experiencer, all wrapped up in a potential, right? That's it. So there can't ever not be a you, but it's not Andrew. It's always reality itself. Always reality itself. And we identify in whatever form we're in. That's it, right? And that's why, they're like, oh, it's the eternal I am, right? But that's just the experience of I am, right? The reality is just being. There's no word for it, right? It's everything exists because it can, because it has the potential to do so.
Yeah, like there isn't this, we like to think there's this kind of superimposed reason based on our perspective of how we see ourselves and everything else. Like the reason for it is like a very dualistic perspective that, oh, this happened, there must be a reason for that. But recognizing that there isn't, as that kind of falls away, as does the division, as does the cause and effect mindset. And it's like the cause is the effect, the effect is the cause. There's no division between those two. And so on Friday, I was kind of, it's kind of like I was seeing the void or the abyss for a bit. And like, there's still discomfort in that for sure. But I'm getting more used to it. And that, because like, there was a few minutes where I was like, oh, fuck, I don't know about this. And then, I get off the call, go back to the people in the house that I'm with, and it kind of like settles back in. So it's like you can see it, you can recognize that, but it doesn't change, but it does. Like it really does change how you interact with reality, and it can be a beneficial understanding when you don't get lost in it or like don't take it too seriously. Because if you do, it's like, and the perception of division goes away, at least momentarily. It's like like what even is there to do? But like you can do anything, but if you get caught up in like the fear of it, it can freak you out.
It's the opinion of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because opinion always goes back to that sense of identity, which is fear, right? So as soon as you're giving into your opinion of everything you're seeing, you're limiting how much you're seeing, which I think is actually kind of our defense mechanism. It's almost like we start to see how much we are, and we go, and that's how we're protecting ourselves. We're pulling back and holding on to opinion in order to cut off the flow. Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So like, and we don't even realize that though. We do it almost unconsciously until we see it get a glimpse into the reality of what we're avoiding. It's like, then it's not that it kind of makes sense after you see it, but it's not necessary. But if you don't see it or recognize that through, letting go of yourself, that it becomes more available. It's like you're kind of unconsciously formulating all of these opinions using the defense mechanism without knowing why. And so you're just caught in it. But that process of understanding why is a process. Like I don't like saying journey or process or anything, but it's like it is. I think maybe just based on the degree of distortion that we have and hold on to out of fear, it's like we're using this defense mechanism that we don't even necessarily understand why, in a way, because we're so far from seeing why.
It's the thing though, like our experience is progression. Like we are experiencing duality, right? So that doesn't just mean your journey. That means the journey of your environment as well, right? So the why may just be appropriateness to the rest of the environment, which is still you. It's just that we're focused on our little tiny part, right? Instead of recognizing, right, it's not just a little tiny part, it's part of the whole fabric, it's part of the whole tapestry, it's all moving together. So maybe the why is because it has to be, which is kind of the most frustrating answer, right?
Yeah, it is. It kind of reinforces that, not the thing that makes me uncomfortable, but kind of like looking into the void or the abyss, or kind of seeing that it's like there's no relativity, like there's no this versus that. It's just it is because it's like and that's so unsatisfying to the ego and to me and fucking A. Like, it is because, like, oh Jesus Christ, like that doesn't give me any satisfaction. That might be the least satisfying statement I could ever say to someone, but that's what it is. And so we almost create the opinions to satisfy that, but it's unsatisfiable. And so it just reinforces and perpetuates the suffering, because we're trying to grasp. It's like grasping onto something that isn't there, and we just keep trying to do it until we can recognize that we don't have to, and we can, but not with the same weight anymore.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I went deep on this one. The idea that there's no God to meet, like there's no creator. It's a real kick in the teeth. You take that long enough and recognize it's just you and eternity. It's a lot. We want there to be a creator. We want there to be creation. We want there to be a rhyme and a reason, because the alternative is eternity. And so we do all this for a very good reason. Because as beautiful as that is, it's a lot. Right. And it's taken time for you, me, us collectively, individually, collectively, to come to terms with that reality again. Because even in recognizing that, there's a double-edged sword. Remember, all the things we're talking about change our perception of the world and each other, and make different opportunities available. We talk about past civilizations, or the idea of them, the possibility of previous pinnacles of human existence and previous types of technology and things like that, all of which would be the result of a greater state of awareness, right? Aliens, UFOs, extraterrestrials, the idea of interstellar flight, all of that kind of hinges on the idea of seeing the universe in a dramatically different way than we do right now. A friend of mine once put it this way, because we were talking at the beginning of the episode of kind of how primitive we are, that we're so primitive that we're driving around in metal little boxes that are propelled by exploding dinosaur bones.
Oh goodness. Yeah. It's funny when you see it like that, but yeah, it is a lot, and it does make sense why we do all of this. It's almost like to directly avoid this recognition. But then when you start to look at the way things are right now and the absurdity of it, if you're still, the frustration comes from a perception of division as well. Like with the absurdity of this conversation that we're having right now, of the, staring into the void, whatever, and seeing there's no relativity between anything other than what we create within ourselves. Like, it is because it can, or it is because it can, because whatever. like any of those statements are, and then to see the way things are right now with the amount of destruction and lack of clarity and just anger and frustration and suffering and killing and all of that is like, it's such a far end of the other side of the spectrum of recognizing that it's just you for eternity. And there is no not you. There also is, it's like there is you, but I feel like that almost implies other as well. Like if it's all
Language.
you, yeah, I know. It's like I guess the vastness of that, the never ending, the infiniteness of space.
That's why I have an issue with that whole I am thing, right? Like, oh, it's the divine I am. It's like, when you really get it, you kind of recognize, like, even the word I, it's a bit of a distortion because there has to be a you.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. And like you said, language is just inherently divisive. Like you can never absolutely clearly say what it is. We can just do our best to get there, but you can never, there's no touching the line like on a curve on a graph. It's like there is no touch to that when you're using language. But
Yeah, it can't
yeah,
can't be done. I had this conversation on TikTok this weekend because somebody's like, "No, I disagree." It's a given. Of course you are. What else could there be?
so what were they disagreeing with?
That I am is the most important thing to be able that we can say, that it's necessary for the universe, basically, that it's the divine I am. And this is something that goes around a lot because it sounds really good and it's very biblical, right? I am that I am, despite the fact that in the Torah, that's not what it says, right? So we just really got attached to that divine I am because it's very self-affirming, especially for the ego.
I was just funny when you said for the ego. I was just thinking right before that, it's pretty egotistical. Like it is still, it's so funny how it pops up in so many ways, even the extreme end of, being so close to letting go of that perception of division, of the me, of the idea of myself. It still is able to come up in the I am, because it implies idea of you in a way.
Oh, it implies so much worse too. It implies that there's a source I am. That's the big one that gets me. It has that same intonation as God, that we're a part of something larger. Like computers connected to a network. That's often the view. Because again, we don't like the reality, which is that it's just you. All of it is just you. You look at yourself as a small fraction of it because of your self-image. That's the experience you're having, is this very tiny perspective of yourself. And as you let that go, you start to recognize it really is all you. And that path has been largely unexplored. It's the narrow path that Jesus was talking about, as opposed to the wide path traveled by many, right? It's unexplored because it's uncomfortable. And again, our society currently is based on the reward system that goes along with being divided. That's the biggest problem. There is a reward system for perceiving yourself as divided. Right? Basically, it's interesting. There's a song by Eddie Vedder. I can't remember what the song's title is, but he says, it's interesting to me that we have agreed to which we have agreed. And it's basically this global agreement that greed is a good thing. And that's really funny because that's exactly what it is. That's why our society is so focused on competition, right? It's because we're so focused on division.
Yeah, without so much perception of division, there is way less competition, if any, and because you're just competing with yourself, thinking that you're not. But there's so much less responsibility in that idea of being connected to source, a fragment of source, a computer and a network, that type of thing. There's so much less responsibility, and it's still holding on to, even if you say you don't believe in God, there's still that belief that there's a creator to meet. There's something other than you. That's all it ever comes down to, is if you perceive that there's something other than you, it's always going to come up in any way that you try to express it. Because even just that statement, even though I haven't believed in Sky Daddy in a while, talking about that at the retreat, that there's no creator to meet, it just hits differently. Like, it really, even if you recognize that this idea of Sky Daddy doesn't exist and you've let that one go, there's no creator to meet. That's heavy. That's fucking heavy. Oh man.
Especially for eternity.
Yeah.
And that's the rabbit hole I went down on a specific psychedelic trip that we've talked about previously. I went deep down that rabbit hole. The fact that it's always you forever. There's only the perception of division. And I suffered through all of the loneliness and the isolation that goes with that perception. Right? As an eternal being that will never meet its creator, that will just exist because you are existence itself. You start to actually feel for God. You actually start to empathize with the perspective of being unity. And that's the reason that you don't vilify the ego. It's because you recognize it's the governor. It's how we slow down our acceptance of this incredibly large insight of accountability, of responsibility. That's why it's so uncomfortable. Think about it. If it's just me and you look at the world, holy shit, I've been putting off cleaning up after this party, right? And it's just because, oddly enough, the putting it off is the focusing on myself as the fiction. See, we keep wanting to fix reality, but reality is all fucked up because we're not accepting that we are reality. That division is what makes it possible for us to throw garbage, in a nature reserve, or to just, throw our shit out the window. It's what makes it possible to be rude to a stranger just because you're focused on yourself. It changes everything. It changes everything. And that's the point, is that we keep tackling this from the wrong end. We keep trying to fix reality instead of recognizing we're reality. The problem, the thing that's broken about reality, is our lack of accountability as it.
Yeah. So circling around this insight, and because I feel like even, saying that you are reality, like, that's super beneficial to reality. You're still able very much to hold on to the idea of yourself in that recognition. So I'm curious, like, going deeper, as we were just touching on with the eternity and being God for forever, all of it, like being it, not even God. Like, I even that word is
Cheap.
implies, yeah, like it's so much fucking deeper than that. Is that the, I don't even know how to phrase this, but, like, is that the deepest insight you can have? Like, is that, not that it's the end, because that's not what I'm saying, but, like, there's depth to that recognition. But could there even be anything?
That's the far
deeper?
end of the conceptual mess.
Yeah.
Because that's where all your concepts break down. Right? That's the rabbit hole we haven't explored. what happens beyond the concept of division. But yeah, that's it. That's where all our concepts stop. That's one of the reasons it makes us so uncomfortable. Right? Even the concept of a creator, which is one of the hardest ones to let go of. That's why I was facing that one for so long, because it's pinnacle to our existence. It really is. That perceived division, absolutely. Like I still find myself dipping in and out of it from time to time as we have these conversations about the larger flow of things, about surrendering, as it were, to flow state and all that, because that very much implies that there's a flow outside yourself, but you are the flow. Right. So again, you find yourself still using concepts to describe what is undescribable with concepts. And each and every time you hold on to a concept, it's allowing you to continue to interact with the world in a way that's familiar to you, but slightly modified. Then you question that concept, you go a little deeper again. Right. And the whole question is the depth of that. How does that impact not just my experience, but my experience, the individual collective? Right? Because it's all one thing. There's no division. You are what is.
Yeah, I find myself bouncing kind of off that recognition, like a flow state. We love to think that, you can be in and out of flow state. Even the idea like we want to be in flow state implies that, it can be possible to not be in flow state. Like that's more comfortable than recognizing that you can't not be in flow state. Because that's kind of the same thing of being it. There's no creator to meet for all of eternity. It's the same kind of a different perspective of the same recognition. It's like all of a sudden in my head, the way it's like processes it is going from like, flow state, not flow state, me kind of like bouncing between to they just connect. Like they just meet. And it's like, oh, it's like it's very relaxing, but at the same time very heavy. It's almost like,
Isn't it funny how freedom is heavy?
Yeah, it's almost like, when you're relaxed, like your shoulders drop and you kind of just like feel everything sink down. It's almost like is that like a weight almost pushing you down? Not a weight in the sense of like a ball and a chain, but just like, I don't know, sinking into where you're at. Whereas
I
when
always think of it as like groundedness.
Yeah.
Right. That's where the reality kicks in. And that's what we're always saying, right? The philosophy is the disease for which it should be the cure. Right. The concepts aren't the point. The concepts aren't the point. It's not about talking about unity. It's not about saying we're all connected. It's about letting go and seeing it full in the face, deeper and deeper and deeper throughout your existence, because it changes everything you do, it changes everything you see, and it changes your capacity to experience existence with less conflict and more freedom, I guess is the way to put it, or the best way I can put it. But it really is just about the inevitable recognition that happens when you surrender, because it's inevitable. The question is just how much are you willing to surrender? And that's it. There's no obligation by any means. You can hold on to your idea of yourself your entire life. Right? You can struggle, you can try and build yourself up, you can dream, you can set goals, you can do all of that. And there's nothing wrong with it. Unless there is to you. But it's important to be honest about that. And it's difficult to be honest about that when you're firmly rooted in an environment that is yours, that is your dream, that is largely created around the avoidance of freedom, that is largely created as an overcommitment to that idea of yourself. It's very difficult to break out of that when everybody around you is saying, this is the only game in town. Right. And that's largely because you, all of you, have been avoiding this for so long. And I say so long, just to throw this back in the mix, in this timeline, in this iteration of the story, because there's numerous other iterations of the story that still exist here and now where you're not avoiding it at all.
Oh man. Yeah, that's an interesting one too, that just all of the, you know, timelines are all of the possibilities from, rooted in right now, beyond this, all all happen as well. And I experienced this one, but it's not even that. I think I expressed this a couple weeks ago, that we think of all the paths. It's like, there's 100 from right now, approximately. From here, I could say, talk about this. I could completely shift, be like, I like the color blue, and it's interesting, and this pair of blue jeans, and whatever. It's like just go on a complete tangent. But it's not 100. It's not 1,000. It's not 1,000,000. It's an infinite number of iterations. And so those lines that you perceive of like this being the root here and now to, kind of like ribbons coming off of it, they all kind of compress into, it's like an infinite number, but also you're only experiencing one. So it's like both and neither of those. I forget where I was going with the start of this, but I think just that recognition is, I don't know, like just kind of mind blowing, and also
And the fact that your path right now is the result of numerous other points where you had 100 different options to get to where you are now. And they all exist in the here and now. See, that's the thing about the multiverse, right? It's not just that every possible option from where you are now exists, but every possible option before now that got you to now. Because there's numerous different nows that you could be in right now that all could have, like this morning, for example, you could have gotten up, sent me a text and said, I don't feel like doing the show today, and be doing something else entirely. And that would have been based on other nows happening before then that would have modified your option for this morning, because you would have had a different mentality that would have changed your choice, right? So that's the point, is that every now affects all the other nows, but we're always deciding in what way, because they all exist now.
it's like you're never not experiencing the one that you are. So it's like you are that always, it, after and before each infinite number of things that could have led to here now, and anywhere that they're going here now, but you can't experience any of those simultaneously unless you can.
That's a really good question, isn't it? Right. And this is where we go back to the conversation we were having in community topics number 18 about tarot and imagination and addiction. And again, even going into our last episode on season 4, episode 4, about the subconscious, we don't really know. We don't really know what's possible for us as awareness at all. I mean, again, we were talking about Buddha closing his eyes and saying he experienced 10,000 lives. It's like, wow, okay. Because we're talking about the capacity of awareness free of concepts like time, like space, like individuality. That's a lot of imagination. Like, that is an untapped, quote unquote, imagination that is awareness. So yeah, I don't know what's possible at all. I'll never say I know what's possible, but I know that as you were describing all of those moments, you were catching fragments of them in your mind, right? And so if you were to slow down even more, those fragments would expand. They would become easier for you to look at a little bit clearer, right? Because that's always the point, is that we rush past things, and it's that rushing that limits our perspective or our appreciation of them. Same is true for our imagination. You can get so immersed in, again, your imagination that it feels real, right? Like hypochondria is a perfect example, right? People who are always thinking that they're sick actually end up becoming sick.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like if you're fearing being sick, you're imagining it. And could that be experiencing, another timeline in your mind? Could it be that our imagination / mind is our ability to experience all of the other infinite pathways and potentials at all times, and there can be almost like an overlap where we perceive an experience, and it's not that it's exactly this experience, but there's like enough overlap that it actually happens in this reality, and our imagination and mind is our ability to tap into the vastness of myself and potentially experience other lifetimes. And it makes me wonder if that's not just what's happening right now, and I've just said that this one's real.
Totally possible. Or what's the limits in terms of human longevity? Right? Like we talk about our lifetimes and the development of illness and disease over time. Deepak Chopra, in his book, Ageless Body, Quantum Mind, was talking about the fact that nobody dies of old age. Nobody dies of old age. They always die of some illness that results from the weakening of their body over time. But nobody actually dies of old age, which is really interesting, especially given the conversation we were having about cancer in community topics number 17, and the results of stress, the effect of stress, the effect of, again, the perception of division. If you think about it, what's more stress inducing than fear? Right? And how it contributes to illness. And so the question being, again, like, what's possible when you really do recognize it's all you and your body falls in line with that? Right? You start thinking about spontaneous remissions, you start thinking about miracle healings, that kind of thing, whenever they actually have legitimately happened. And you start to wonder, what was the change there? And that's the thing we can't quantify, because each and every person is so very different. Right? For you to make a conscious leap is not something that we have the ability to measure or understand as a society. And so if you were to be ill and suddenly have a leap of intuition that changed your entire viewpoint on everything so dramatically that your body had no choice but to adapt accordingly, because your diet changed, your environment changed, your habits change, your perceptions change, your stress all drops, things like that, and your body's just like, holy shit, we got to reinvent ourselves now. There's no way for us to go, how are you thinking differently now? We can ask a survey, but that doesn't really give us an answer, because again, we're looking at concepts, and concepts are always limited by not just the person using them, but the person listening to them. So we're all stumbling around dark in this perception of division, trying to communicate with one another from the perception of division, wondering why we can't hear one another.
Like existing in that state is always going to perpetuate the distortion that we're kind of like trying to escape, sort of, but like, are we trying to escape it, or are we clinging to it because we're afraid of escaping it? Kind of like, a prison cell with an open door. We don't know what's out there, so we stay in it, and we keep going because we've figured out ways to feel better or more comfortable to the degree that we can understand that end of, comfort or relaxation that's super limited based on our perception of ourself. And so we're not even willing to, wonder or question what's possible beyond that, and all of the potentials that could come from just continuing that process of questioning, from staring into the void or the abyss without so much of an opinion, and just in a state of closer to a state of curiosity and kind of wonder and awe in it, but not thinking anything of it. So it's like, as we exist in the mentality that for the most part we currently do, believing that the perception of division is the truth, like everything we do is going to be distorted by that. Always. It can't not be.
Yeah, because it's all one thing. It's all connected, right? But that's the point, is that You make all the difference. You are the difference. That's what this is about, but not you, the idea of you, everything. So don't beat yourself up for not changing the world overnight, because you're vast. It takes time, right? Just like walking downstairs after you wake up in the morning takes time based on the distance and your physical capacity. Changing the world takes time based on the distance and our physical capacity. Like, not only do you have to change in your body and in your awareness, you got to ripple out to the rest of you. That takes time, right? But that's the point, is that you can free yourself from your cell, and the other people around you in their own cells will eventually start to learn that they can do the same, until all of us just walk out of prison together, because that's the direction we've been going in this whole time, because we put ourselves there to avoid freedom for a bit, because I think maybe we stopped appreciating it. And now we have plenty of reasons to appreciate it again, and the path to rediscovering it, which is beautiful. And I'm very glad to be here with everyone. On that note, we have to end this episode of Dualistic Unity Raw. We're going to be continuing on Patreon directly after this, patreon.com/dualistic unity. You can join us, be on the screen, talk to us, share your stories, get deeper into this conversation. We would love to see you. This has been a lot of fun. I'm very excited for this arbitrary year that we are now a part of, and to see how all this unwraps or unfolds over time. Unwraps, you can tell just Christmas just passed.
Yeah, for sure. Excited for the Patreon chat. This is a fun one. This second half. Oh boy. Yeah, this will be fun to keep it going on Patreon in a few minutes here. But yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll talk